I would now like to welcome Susan Dreyfus. Susan is the, excuse me, Susan is the president and CEO of Families International, the parent organization in the United States of the Alliance for Children and Families, United Neighborhood Centers of America, Ways to Work, and FEI Behavioral Health. Prior to joining Families International, Susan was secretary for the Washington State Department of Social and Health Services. In 1996, she was appointed the first administrator of the Division of Children and Family Services in Wisconsin. Her portfolio included child welfare, child care quality and licensing, youth development, and other community and emergency assistance programs. Susan is a member of Leadership 18, a coalition of CEOs from the largest and most respected nonprofit organizations in America. Susan will come up and give us a speech or some remarks, and then we'll have a Q&A session to follow. We might run a few minutes into coffee break, but I'm going to tell you right now it would be well worth our time. Thank you for joining us today, Susan. Welcome.
Thank you so much. So what's an American doing here on a day like today, right? My husband and I got here on Saturday. You have a beautiful, we've never been to Canada before. We've had such a lovely time the last couple of days. But I'll tell you, when that flight lands, we're going home and watching our television set. So glad to be with you all, but mine's a little bit someplace else right now. Went to St. James Cathedral, your beautiful cathedral here, for a most glorious Mass on Sunday. And I think people got wind that there are a couple of Americans there, and boy, were they crowding around us wanting to talk about the election. I think you're more interested in it than we are, actually, which is kind of fun. I want to thank OMSSA and Cleona, wherever she is a jewel in helping to make this happen. It's wonderful. And I also want to just tell you, as someone that has spent most of my career in the public sector, I have the utmost admiration and respect and appreciation for you. There are many that think they could do your jobs. There are few who truly can. And I want to thank you so much for your commitment to public service here in Canada. We have a lot to share with each other across our countries. I think we're both trying to achieve much of the same thing right now, as we really are grappling with this reality that, you know, the money we have is the money we have, right? And we're trying to figure out how to deliver greater value and have even broader outcomes for our investment of taxpayer dollars. And I think we each understand, and I'm always telling my colleagues this back home, it's so important that we all remember as we do this work day in and day out, that really at the heart of it, we have to always understand that we are advocates first. We know how crucial the safety net is to our most vulnerable citizens in this world. And we know that right now, across the world, it is not just true in America, it's not just true in Canada, the economic and social compact between all citizens and government is being renegotiated. And it's why today I want to begin my conversation with you in what I call my theory of change. If we want to enjoy prosperity, we must foster the health and well-being of all people. And we certainly understand that when we talk about the health and well-being of all people, you can certainly give people access to health care, and that doesn't mean you've improved their health. You can have people achieve health outcomes from a medical perspective, and it doesn't mean we've improved their well-being. In February 2011, in Health Affairs, there's a 10-year study in Canada of socially disadvantaged patients. And its findings were that they use more health services, but they still have poor health. Not just access, but they don't just have the access, which is so critical, but they lack the skills to appropriately access and have the ability and the confidence to self-advocate for themselves and the ability to change their behavior. My aha moment in the public sector, serving on a governor's healthcare reform cabinet, and you all know America is all abuzz about healthcare reform, and we learned so much from you. And one of the things that was quite clear to me is when we really looked at our numbers, 5% of the population were driving 50% of the expenditures. And when we used our predictive analytical capability, we realized that these flies were the perfect biopsychosocial storm. and only 10% of the outcomes that we were trying to achieve were going to be predicated and based on the medical care that folks received. And then we add the adverse childhood experiences science that we have in America that I'm sure you know well, when we realize that there are certain adverse childhood experiences that can happen early in a child's life and present incredible predictors of poor health, present incredible predictors of a person's inability to attach to the workforce, a person's inability to achieve safe and stable relationships. And then we went even further in our adverse childhood experiences science in Washington State, where we realized that when there were certain capacities that existed within communities, ability to share knowledge, leadership, planning, the ability to leverage resources in the most broadest way, we actually found that ACE scores, adverse childhood experience scores, went down in those communities, and yet we oftentimes would segmentize social services from health. And in my theory of change, my belief is we cannot bend the cost curve of healthcare. We cannot have a healthier population until we recognize fully this biopsychosocial intersection of health and realize that social services is health. The second part of my theory of change is that as leaders, we must articulate a clear and compelling vision, create a culture for innovation and partnership, and practice adaptive leadership skills. Your Deputy Minister of Education, George Zagaric, I'm sure some of you know George. I met George in Harvard in 2011 when I presented there on how I believed in America, we call it impact. Here, I believe you call it broader outcomes. But I presented on how, in human services, we had to position ourselves for impact. And one of the things with meeting George, I think it's a lot to do with why I might be here, he and I really connected because at the end of my presentation, I said to my colleagues just like you from around the country, I said to my colleagues, what we fundamentally have here as we are wanting to transform our systems, as we are wanting to have greater impact, broader outcomes in people's lives, what I believe we fundamentally have is a leadership challenge. It's why I talk about adaptive leadership and the work of Dr. Ron Heifetz from Harvard. Our first inclination, folks, with the best of intentions, is that whenever things become ambiguous, whenever things become challenging, whenever things become complex, our first inclination is to try to find the first technical response that we can to shut that ambiguity down. And yet I believe that it is an ambiguity when we as leaders welcome it, embrace it, manage it well. I believe that's where we find that the number one leadership trait for us, whether in the public sector or the nonprofit sector as I sit today, is creativity. I believe that through this notion of creating a culture of innovation and partnership and to practice adaptive leadership skills, history will look back on this great worldwide recession, and it is tough. For my work in the public sector during this great recession, man, I'll tell you, it felt like going back to the Great Depression in America, and so many of the stories were so similar. And I think history will look back on us as leaders. And one of the questions that I think we are going to be judged by is whether or not we fully embraced and mastered the art of what I call shared governance. What that means, though, for us is it's very important as we move on with this theory of change, is that we have to move from program thinking to systems change thinking as the only way to achieve the ultimate outcomes we strive for. And we cannot do this without shared governance, a crystal clear clarity of the policy that we are trying to achieve, and recognizing that until it gets embedded and aligned across all systems and sectors, we will not achieve what I believe we ultimately need to be achieving and need to recognize that every one of our community and social services systems need to see themselves and be seen as reducing the number of people who live in poverty, increasing the number of people living safe and healthy lives, and putting more people onto pathways for educational and employment success. I believe therein lies the greatest issues of social inequity that we struggle with as a world, and I believe that it is until all community and social services systems both see themselves and are seen to the relevancy of this larger impact or broader outcomes, we simply will not be successful in our work. Continuing in this theory of change, does it require us to move from a linear and transactional mindset? We keep trying to reform our systems from the outside in. And so much of what I want to share with you today is how these systems and the lives that we are trying to transform from the inside out. It will require us to move from a linear and transactional mindset to a dynamic and transformational view across sectors and systems. And sharing accountability, that notion of shared governance, for the alignment of shared policy, goals, and values across systems and sectors for collective impact that none of us alone can achieve. I will tell you that one of the greatest examples of this, if you want to see it, is in Cincinnati, Ohio. And watch Ohio in the elections, Ohio and Florida, that'll be it. But is in Cincinnati, Ohio, a project called Strive. It is a classic example, and I could give you so many others, of this notion of collective impact, this notion of a community sharing a clear and common goal. And in that case, it's to make sure that all children successfully graduate from high school on time. And the recognition that no one system, not just the education system alone, can get that done, and recognizing it as a larger shared community responsibility where it requires the policy to be aligned across systems and sectors, and it requires folks to both share the authority and the accountability for getting that done. I believe that what they're realizing is in Cincinnati, Ohio, at a time when resources are at such a premium, that there are many hidden assets that exist within that sense of shared governance, that notion of collective impact, that notion of alignment of a common goal and policy across sectors and systems, that there are many hidden assets that exist within our communities that actually create resources. And I'm going to give you an example of that today. In America right now, we're very focused on what we call the human services value curve. And as you look at this, I want you to think about, and I'll just give you a couple of examples. When you're at the regulative part of this human services value curve, you're serving constituents, making sure that they're eligible for particular services while complying with categorical policies and program regulations. An important thing, and I would tell you that in our human services systems, we're probably all of these things at any one time, but what we're striving for in America is how to move in to this generative state. In the collaborative, we're supporting constituents in receiving all services that they are eligible for. Very important. Your work with your benefits portal project, many examples of that in America. Very important work to be done. In the collaborative, we're supporting constituents in receiving all service, in the integrative, we are focusing on root causes of needs and problems by coordinating and integrating at optimum levels. Again, very important. Some of the work that I was involved in was making sure the tight integration happened between juvenile justice, child welfare, and the children's mental health system as an example of how to integrate our services. But in the generative, which is the example I'm going to share with you today, in my experience in Washington State with redesigning what we called Work First, our welfare to work program in Washington State. In the generative state, you focus on generating healthy communities through shared governance and co-creating solutions for multi-dimensional family and socioeconomic challenges and opportunities. I want to say this human services value curve coming out of this work we've been doing in America is out of the Harvard Center for a Networked World. And I want to recognize, I know she's not here today, but Janet Menard, the Commissioner of Human Services in the Region of Peel, I met her this past October at Harvard in our conversations with this and had such a delightful conversation with her, and I'm sorry she couldn't be with us here today. So this human services value curve, I want to bring it to life to you today and tell the story of one state, one secretary. One state, the state of Washington, on the Pacific, beautiful Pacific Northwest of America, and one secretary, that would be me, who had been appointed by what I think is one of the best governors in America, Governor Christine Gregoire. She absolutely understood going into this great recession. In just over 2.5 years, I had to cut spending between health and social services over $4 billion. That's how hard this recession hit us. But Governor Gregoire was one to never back off of a challenge. And she put her cabinet together and she said to us, now hear this, we are going to lead change. This is going to be a long, hard decade, and there's no such thing as going back to the way it was. There is a fundamental reset that we must lead in Washington State, and you as my cabinet need to do just that. She also was the belief of don't waste a crisis, that it is times in crisis that we find ourselves being open and willing to a level of creativity and partnering and leveraging of resources in ways that we typically never would be when times are good. And in many ways, I felt as a leader, I don't know how many of you have watched the movie Apollo 13, but when they dump everything out on the table and they say to the team, you have this much time to take these things and figure out how to make this square thing fit into this round hole. Remember that scene? That's how I felt. The money I had was the money I had. The resources I had were the resources I had. But what I found in this work, in this agency that I had responsibility for, I'm sure one that you could recognize here in Canada, what I found were many hidden assets that were not being leveraged to a common purpose and goal, again, that we were about in our work. The Department of Social and Health Services that I led had all of aging and long-term care, including persons with developmental disabilities, mental health, chemical dependency, child welfare, juvenile justice, all of the state's economic assistance programs, including our Welfare to Work program. Now that sounds like a lot, but from where I sat in the height of this great recession, I felt like what I was leading was a large, small agency, because so much of it intersected and came together. We realized that we had simply been operating in silos, and what we had to embrace was a one-department view, that we were one department under one vision, one mission, one set of goals and values that we were achieving, and that everything was ultimately leading us to that ultimate impact statement that I shared with you earlier when I shared my theory of change. We found that we had so many hidden assets that we weren't recognizing, and a few examples of that. In America, I'm sure as here, our work in long-term care was so much further progressed than our work in other parts of our social services delivery system. And we found that in that experience were many hidden assets of knowledge and resources that we could bring to bear as we were trying to transform other systems like child welfare, juvenile justice, and our work program. We found, for instance, in our Child Protective Services system, that we had many assets sitting in there that were so helpful to our Adult Protective Services side of the house. Again, recognizing that we had more in common than not, and yet our hierarchical organizational chart had kept us from realizing all the resources that we clearly had at our disposal. And we had this reality, 11%, and I'm sure it would be true here, 11% of all that we served across that vast agency drove 43% of all of our expenditures. The uncovered power that we found in big data, data analytics that we had sitting in our healthcare side of the house became critically important to the example I'll share with you today of how we went about redesigning our work program. We found that we had basically the goal in front of us was I kept having this vision in my mind, and you all know that sometimes You know, a visual image, what we're trying to achieve, can be so helpful, both in how we explain it to others, but also how we think about it ourselves. And in my mind, what I was turning was a large ship in a very narrow canal. And I knew I needed 2 tugboats to make that happen. One was that I had to win over the hearts and minds of a couple thousand of my 20,000 employees, just a couple thousand. And I had to do that from being out front, being with them, being deliberate, but I had to win over a couple thousand of their hearts and minds. And the second was external. How much time I needed to be spending, and we need to be spending, whether it's with philanthropy, whether it's the business sector, whether it's with our key stakeholders and our authorizing environments, but that I had to win over their hearts and minds as well to exert the pressure on this tremendous bureaucracy that I had to lead through a difficult time of change to make change happen. I'm not expecting you to read this, so don't panic. But I share this with you because I think oftentimes one of the things that we fail to do is be able to create a strategic framework for how we're going to lead forward and be able to capture it in a way that on one page we are very clear about who we are, what we do, what our priorities are, and what will be the most important thing on here for us were the actions that would basically be the actions that would show that we were definitely leading differently in a very different time. Those actions that I want to share with just a few of you on was this notion of linear to dynamic relationships. So what do I mean by that? One of the very first things I did is I went to meet the superintendent of public instruction. I guess maybe here that might be George. And I went to meet the superintendent of public instruction. Now here I was, the social service agency, going over to meet with a separately elected official running the education system. And I looked at him, his name was Randy, and I said, Randy, what can I do to help you improve the graduation rate in the state of Washington? Because all of your kids that are dropping out are sitting on my caseloads, and I know them at birth, because we're covering 50% of all the births in the state and all of the low-income children. And so I said, what can I do to help you improve the graduation rate in the state of Washington? And that led us to a wonderful body of work that we did together that's continuing to this day, of recognizing our multi-system involved families whose children are in low-performing schools, and realizing those schools can't turn around without us, and we can't deal with these multi-system issues families are addressing if we cannot bring the school along with us. The Department of Early Learning. I wasn't the early learning department. I'm a fierce advocate for early childhood development in those first 2,000 days of these little babies' lives as being critical to their life trajectories. But I went over and I met down with my counterpart, the smallest state agency. I was the largest state agency. She was like, what is this woman wanting to come over and meet with me for? And I said, Betty, what can I do to help you achieve your mission? And it wasn't that I wanted to create programs and services for early learning. I knew that what I had to do is take the science of early learning and assure that it was being adopted in every aspect of our policy and practice throughout our human services delivery system. That was how I could help Betty achieve her mission, and I believe ultimately bend the cost curve for my systems. The principles that we use, and I'm just going to give you a quick overview of how this all came to be, these things I'm talking about this morning, in what's called Work First. And in America, our federal financing system for Work First, our welfare to work programming, is called TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. I went over and met with the governor. And I said, Governor, I haven't known you really long because she and I did not know each other before she appointed me, and it was truly the honor of a lifetime to work for her. But I had responsibility for this Work First program, and it was cut across 6 different agencies, and everybody did their own little thing. But there was no sense of cohesion and focus and shared policy and what we were ultimately trying to do, which from my perspective is to get people onto pathways out of poverty. And so I went over and sat down with the governor. I said, Governor, I'm not sure what this program is and what it is that you believe we're achieving in this program. But I can tell you this. We are so busy capturing participation and counting it that we are not making a fundamental difference in people's lives. I shared with her that 38% of the children in this program being serving their parents, 38% of the children graduated from high school. 38%. And I've got to believe it wouldn't be all that different here. I shared with her this. A child living in a household of 4 with an income under $15,000 in America is 22 times more likely to be maltreated than a child living in a household of 4 with an income over $30,000. I don't believe that poverty causes the maltreatment of children. I've been child welfare director in 2 different states in America. But I do believe the stresses of poverty that weigh down on families are a high correlate to maltreatment. And remembering that most maltreatment is neglect, and most neglect is caused by a parent's inability to meet the basic needs of their children. So I said to the governor, we have to reform this program. We are spending way too much money. We are looking at less dollars that we're going to have in the future. And we have to move from what I said was participation that counts to engagement that matters. We looked at this program and we realized that there are a few things. I'm going to go back here just real quick, and just a couple of these I want to point on. These were the principles that we use. And I found some of these in some of the reports I read about you in terms of your Circles program in Lambton and Wellington, who's ever here from there. I think some of the work you're doing in your Circles program reminds me very much of these kinds of principles. But the one that I want to focus on, the one that I think that we as leaders it's so important that we really are sure that we are authentically living this principle. And that is using a family-centered case planning and engagement approach to being truly person, family-centered, and strengths-based. And recognizing that being truly person, family-centered, and strengths-based is not simply a methodology or a way in which we train our staff in doing their work. It is a fundamental orientation that has to be grounded in our policy and in every action that we take and decision that we make, both internally and externally. The other thing that we were very clear about is this notion of the importance of leveraging all resources. And folks, I have to tell you, this program cut across 6 different state agencies. You talk about folks disconnecting on one another and thinking we were doing good work when really it was very transactional, not at all what I would call transformational. But I have to tell you that when we grasped a common policy, these common principles, the amount of resources that we found, that we had within us and within our partnerships were really quite profound as we move forward at a time of great austerity in terms of the lack of resources and revenue that we had coming in. We knew that we had to, again, starting with the end in mind, we do what we measure, right? We were very clear that we needed a very different set of outcomes, broader outcomes, as you would call them here. And the first was that kids are doing well. I think oftentimes in these programs we lose sight of the children in these households. And when we took this approach, it was amazing, the resources that we found, the intersection we found with our child welfare agencies, the intersection we found in our education agencies, and with early learning. Parents are doing well socially, housing, medical, chemical dependency, mental health, and job readiness. I'll share with you in a minute one of the most important things we found was the chemical dependency was even more of an issue for the folks we were serving than mental illness. And yet we had a system that was not doing a very good job of identifying and dealing with that. And lastly, that parents are doing well economically. This notion of wage progression, job retention, and education level. These were our outcomes. And every measure that you saw and will see today in Washington State cascades down from these measures so that every employee and every partner working in that system sees and understands this is the pathway out of poverty using a multi-generational view. Using predictive analytics, I know that you use it here, but I think our largest aha moment is when we truly understood we were using a singular case management approach to a multi-varied population. When we realized the intensive case management needs of less than 30% of the population, and yet 49% of them, the quick leavers, needed very little, and we were throwing everything at them but the kitchen sink, and wondering why we weren't getting good outcomes with them. They needed very little, but we were not meeting them where they were at and giving them what they needed in a short-term basis to get them on the way to self-sufficiency. We developed an employability score, basically looking at a person's history, their barriers, their behavioral health, criminal history, homelessness, child welfare, family, age, gender, education, and their local labor market, because Washington is a very large and diverse state. And using those, we were able to develop a predictability score, which was an employability score for every person in the program, that then would lead us to what different kinds of case management models we would use for each individual person as an individual, not as a collective group, as we were simply treating them before. These were some of our strategies for change. Number one, that this was not an entitlement program, but rather a contract between us and the people that we were serving in a way that would help bring them to lead the fullest of lives and be on pathways to self-sufficiency. I believe that that contract approach, this notion of participation and engagement, was key to our reform efforts, because in our quest to constantly serve, in fact, we moved away from talking about clients, we talked about participants, and we talked about an engagement factor with them that led them to see and understand the shared responsibility that we had with them and they had with us. Every staff member trained on motivational interviewing. I believe this is where social services brings so much to the table. Again, a hidden asset that sat over in one part of my department called the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation that was second to none in the use of motivational interviewing. And training all of our case managers on motivational interviewing, I can't tell you the difference that that made. In fact, it'll be the way that I'll close my story with you today, in terms of how that motivational interviewing had such a seismic change and difference in the lives of the people that we served, but also in our staff. We also, again, sharing governance responsibility across 6 separate agencies. And what was clear and what was key is that we shared common outcomes, as I shared with you before, but we shared authority and accountability. And that sharing of that was not just within government, it was between government, community, and our participants. Some of those strategies for change, one of the things I want to just share, and I'm going to keep moving along here because we're running a little bit late and I'm going to get to my close here, is one of the strategies I do want to share with you is our work with revising our education and training programs to reflect the diverse strengths and needs of participants. I don't know how many of you are aware of the science out of the Harvard Center for the Developing Child. It's called the One Science. And one part of that is adult executive functioning skills. Adult executive functioning skills sit up in your cortex, and they mature through the age of 30. Adult executive functioning skills, now think about the folks we serve and across our social services work as I tell you what these 3 adult executive functioning skills are. Working memory, inhibitory control, and cognitive flexibility. We had a program approach, we had an education job training approach that assumed all of our participants possessed those adult executive functioning skills because we were all the ones that created them. And when we realized that that was different, we sat down with our community college system so that they could revamp that employment and training curriculum and the approach that they used to recognize that so many of the folks we were serving did not possess fully those adult executive functioning skills, and we had to give them opportunities to develop and mature them as the way in which we engage them in job training and employment programs. I'm going to close with what I found to be my very best day in this journey of moving from transactional and linear service delivery to truly transformational, with achieving broader outcomes, impact, as I would say, poverty, health, education, and employment. And yes, I could sit here and provide you all the data that's coming out of Washington State, and one of my proudest things for all of us is we're all but stewards for a time for the positions that we hold. Our jobs do not belong to us. And one of your proudest days as a public servant is that when you leave, you hope folks throw you a nice party. You hope folks for a while say, oh, wasn't it nice when Susan was here? But the best tribute they can give you is that the agency keeps on keeping on, and the things that you started with them are so embedded within the culture of the organization, they do not stop. And my greatest accomplishment that I feel is that the work that we started in Washington State has not stopped. But my best day is not sharing with you all the data that's coming out of our reform efforts. My best day was an email that I received from one of my frontline managers, case managers, someone on the front lines of the work. She said, Secretary Dreyfus, I don't know if you'll even see this email because I've never emailed a secretary before, and I don't even know if you get your own email. I thought that was cute. And she said, but I want to thank you. I want to thank you for the training that I received in motivational interviewing, and I'm going to tell you why. And she gave me the story of Jennifer. Stories are important, and we oftentimes in the public sector get so busy with our data and our reports that we forget the stories. And she told me the story of Jennifer. Jennifer was one of those slow leavers that I talked to you about. Jennifer would stay on the program a long time. She'd get off the program, she'd be back. One of the things I never quite understood is when, as soon as people would get their first check they would get a job, and they would get their checks, and then we would send them the note because we would keep them on assistance longer. I was always shocked at how many people would stop their jobs to come back onto public assistance, because that's what they knew, and that's what they felt they had a greater sense of being able to count on than that job that they just got. I always found that interesting. But this woman kept coming on and off and on and off, and she and this case manager just were like this at one another all the time. And so this case manager now greets Jennifer for the next time using her motivational interviewing skills, meeting Jennifer where she was at, asking Jennifer what she needed and what she felt the issues were that were keeping her from being able to attach successfully to the workforce. And Jennifer created a case plan for herself that was more intensive than what this case manager ever thought she would have been capable of doing. And Jennifer identified a whole lot of natural supports that existed around her that were never being recognized as part of what it was going to take to get her onto that pathway to self-sufficiency. And Jennifer was just doing beautifully, hitting all of her marks and coming in and being so engaged. And the case manager finally looked at her and said, Jennifer, what happened? And Jennifer simply looked at her and said, this is the first time you ever listened to me. This is the first time you ever listened to me. Folks, we are in this at the toughest of times. Please do not feel that I don't understand the significant financial barriers that we face. But I also believe we are in a time of great opportunity to never waste a crisis. There are many hidden assets that sit within our organizations and within our many and varied partnerships and within the hearts and minds of those that we serve and the neighborhoods within which they live. We meet ourselves on a ship already launched, and the results we seek may not be fully accomplished in our lifetimes. Our lives will be judged not by what we did, but by the difference that we made. I am honored to be with you here today. I am honored to be in your beautiful country. And I hope that this is but the beginning of some wonderful reciprocal relationships between my organization and yours, and our public sector in America and yours. We have much to learn from one another. Thank you. Sure. Do you have any questions for me?
Okay, We'll take about 5 minutes for some Q&As if we can. There's mics on either side of the room. Perhaps to start it off, though, I'll launch the first question. And building on how you finished your presentation, Susan, while there are differences in our two countries, we're both trying to achieve many of the same things with many of the same struggles and opportunities. It seems we both benefit from the exchange of ideas. What are ways we can continue to build relationships and learn from one another as countries and across sectors?
Well, I think first of all, and one of the things with Goss, where's Jason? There you go. We ought to do that in our country too, so we'll have to talk about that. I think first of all, we do have to talk about some common sense things where you simply have some strategies and that we can learn from and vice versa, and creating that place for that exchange. And I don't think that always has to be in person. I think we have to create some exciting virtual ways that we can do that. I do hope, though, that you will continue to be represented at the Harvard work that we're doing in October of every year on the Human Services Value Curve. I talked with Kira. To have more representation from Canada would be great. This year we had England, Australia, and Canada there, but we would love to have you there more. I also think it would be nice, and I will talk with Kira about this too, I sit on the board of the American Public Human Services Association, which are all your public sector counterparts, just like you here today. And one of the things I think we need to do more of is figuring out how I might be able to do more reciprocal things with your nonprofit NGO sector and to connect you with the American Public Human Services Association so you have opportunities with your counterparts. What we're also doing differently in America today is we're realizing that, again, those hidden assets is we have to bring our sectors together, that the public and the NGO nonprofit sectors need to be doing more work together, and there too is something that we're doing in America that we could bring forward and potentially do a similar thing here. But we're neighbors, and I think there's so much more we could do together.
Thank you. Okay, Keith, tell us who you are, where you're from, and let's hear your question.
Keith from the County of Dufferin. First of all, Susan, I found your presentation extremely reinforcing, educational, and inspirational, and thank you very much for that. In saying that, in your work, you talked about importance of experimentation and innovation in driving change. What strategies can you share for supporting experimentation when resources are extremely limited in these days?
Thank you. One of the, if you go to our website, at one of the companies that I have under Families International is the Alliance for Children and Families, and we put out a groundbreaking report last year called Disruptive Forces. It's free, download it off our website. I think it's an excellent report. And one of the things we talk about in there is this notion of purposeful experimentation, that we have to be in this notion of beta testing all the time. But it also requires us to have organizational cultures that understand that if through failure we learn, we did not fail. So to create cultures like that is easier said than done, but certainly can be done. So I think what's really important is that, first of all, that we understand that prototyping, beta testing all the time, purposeful experimentation doesn't just happen from our offices, it happens at the front line. And do we have systems that allow that kind of purposeful experimentation to happen on the front lines so that we're constantly creating cultures for new knowledge and learning? And I'll tell you, one of the greatest things in our work was when we had the true and authentic voice of our employees in this process and those that we were serving. The amount of innovative ideas that came out of that were really quite breathtaking. And I tell you, sitting in my office, I never would have come up with them. So I would say one of the most important things is this notion of engagement and license to create and take risk, and that if through failure we learn, we did not fail. Again, of something about that policy shift, that's got to be something from the top down and the bottom up that is understood and embraced.
Okay, I think
It
perhaps...
was wonderful to be with you. Yeah. Thank you so much. I think we're...
Okay. In the interest of time, we got to get to coffee break, and there's something on TV Susan needs to see later today.
Gotta go.
Yeah. So I'd like to thank Susan for sharing her insights with us. I've got a whole list of of quotes here. You're a very quotable speaker. I love some of them. The one I think I like the best was how you started off when you said there are many who feel they could do your jobs. There are few who truly can.
That's right.
And I think when you wrap that with some of your other stories are important, and we need to tell our story. And thank you for coming to tell us your story, and it was an excellent presentation. In lieu of gifts for our speakers, we'll be giving a donation to the Daily Food Bank's People's
lovely.
Blueprint Project, okay?
Lovely. And my husband and I just loved being here. Thank you for sharing this beautiful place with us.
Great.
Thank you.